to that, the question I had for you was, can you help people discern and define or distinguish what makes a protest anti-Semitic? Where is that line?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, since we last met, it looks like there's um, a small plague. I don't want to use the word pandemic. It's like when my kids were in first grade and one kid gets measles or chickenpox. Then you just watch where all the play dates have been, and it's literally popping up everywhere.
It's interesting that you draw that analogy when I see a lot of people on social media drawing almost nostalgic parallels to 1968.
1964, your friend Joseph Edelheit was a 17-year-old freshman at Berkeley, and I watched Mario Savio stand on the roof of a car. There's a wonderful piece by Jerry Rubin's son who said, "Please, this is not the past." Jerry Rubin and others who, quote, protested against the war in Vietnam, the draft, civil rights. At no part of any of those protests did a group of protesters hate someone else on campus.
Hmm. Hmm.
So let's talk about the tragedy of what has happened in American universities. And I'm going to call it the "Please Tell Me What You Mean" campaign.
Hmm.
Everyone who is protesting must answer the question. We'll take off the prefix. Tell me what you mean, Palestinian. What does that mean? Does that mean you support? Now you can answer questions. You're at a university. Do you support the people, all Palestinians, historical Palestinians, Palestinians only in Gaza, but not the West Bank? Does that mean you support Hamas? I want to know what you mean. Let's not talk about anti-Zionism. Let's talk about, do you understand what a Zionist is? We have a video of a young African-American leader wearing a keffiyeh screaming, "Zionists shouldn't live." Okay? Tell me who a Zionist is. A part of my concern is that the university protests involve students who don't know what they mean. They honestly have no historical, critical reflection. Is there a difference between a Jew, an Israeli, and a Zionist? And I'm not just being obnoxious.
Mm-hmm.
I'm serious about, if you're protesting, can you explain the purpose of the protest? Disclose, divest. Okay? Why only Israeli companies? Why not fossil fuel? Should we make sure that we look at the political pedigree of the companies in each university foundation? So, the tragedy of the past 3 weeks is a moment in American history where the political division and failure of serious discourse has now taken over the university.
That's a good entry point for you to talk about the article you sent me, what students read before they protest.
Oh my God. Look, I'm sure at this point, people who have listened to the two of us understand I'm in the center, leaning toward the right. And I'm leaning toward the right because I've been pushed in that direction from the left.
Yeah, same.
I experienced the university protests 10 years ago at St. Cloud State when the Free Palestinian movement had faculty advisors from the anti-racism campus faculty of color. Nothing new here. When they read DEI ideology, when they've read Said, when they come to these issues with a list of ideas, books that lack perspective and critical reflection. Can you read something other than Judith Butler? I understand she's got a lot of interesting ideas. Is she the only one on your reading list? So if we're going to look at this as a snapshot of US political division, then we have to go back and add a foundational layer of DEI, anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, that the Palestinians are now this week's community of color. John McWhorter saying 2 weeks ago, they are humiliating Jews. He's an African-American professor at Columbia who teaches rhetoric and said they are doing this to humiliate Jews because they're white. So, what do the students read? Well, I am now of the conclusion, not a lot. They're not giving themselves the question of critical perspective. They've not read anything from the, quote, Zionist canon. They've not understood that Zionism started before the 20th century, after the Dreyfus Affair, and European anti-Semitism called into question the whole idea of the Enlightenment. We don't live anywhere where we have not been expelled. That was 40 years before Hitler. The nature of what has happened at all of these universities, a moment in which we see the contempt the left has for Israel. And let me add, the current government in Israel has done nothing to help that public impression.
Yeah, I mean, other than just give a big middle finger to public opinion.
Constantly. So I can't defend it, but you ask, what do the students know in conjunction with the nature of their protest? I honestly think they know very little. And what they've read is an ideological defense of what they're doing. It's eisegetical, not exegetical.
Yeah. So this article, it says, when learning about the past, students read a wide range of things from across time, but then comes the 20th century, and suddenly the ambit narrows to progressive preoccupations, and only those preoccupations: anti-colonialism, sex and gender, anti-racism, climate, Fanon and Foucault, Barbara Fields, And it says, many of these readings are absolutely worth engaging, but they still embody a very specific set of ideological commitments. To understand the world before 1900, Columbia students read a range of texts and authors that are important to understanding America and the West in their entirety, Greek and Roman, religious and secular, capitalist and Marxist. To engage with the contemporary world, however, the world they are being prepared to influence and lead, they read texts that are only really important to understanding the perspective of the contemporary left.
And it's the failure of the faculty and what is offered within the curriculum. That's where the accountability must begin.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think government has any business determining a university curriculum. This is where donors, you want my millions, then I want to know whether the great book can still be taught. I want you to read the most contemporary interpretation of the great books. I don't want the great books erased and then only read the contemporary ideology. I'm reading the memoir Knife by Salman Rushdie, and I encourage everyone to read it. It's profound. And when I ask, what do you mean? I want to know if you're pro-Palestinian. Do you know Hamas is Sunni, but they are paid for and funded by the Shia Iranians? Do you support the fatwa for which Salman Rushdie was almost murdered and maimed? Does that include your commitment and understanding of being pro-Palestinian? This idea of being pro-Palestinian has been tragically juxtaposed to being pro-Jewish, where the word Jewish is just deeply conflated, profoundly misused with being, quote, pro-Israel. That too has added to the hatred on campus.
So this this article goes on to talk about how intellectual attention to the 20th century is focused almost entirely on colonialism, and it gives no attention to totalitarianism or authoritarianism. There's no Orwell, no Solzhenitsyn, no Hannah Arendt, no Eichmann in Jerusalem.
And let's add Salman Rushdie.
Which that comment helps make sense of the imbalance between concern for Gaza and a complete lack of attention to the war in Ukraine.
For that matter, the Congo, the Sudan, the nature of why are we facing a crisis of migrants globally? Why are so many people attempting to enter Europe from Africa? What does it mean that there are people fleeing China and attempting to get into Western democracies? So, yes, you can read about the ideological critique of capitalism if you also read history and literature. It is the tragic binary view, and these protesters don't like anything that's binary, but their failure to provide depth is one of the reasons they have no perspective. I am for academic freedom. I am for protests that is productive. Nothing so far I have seen on any campus is going to free the Gazans from the totalitarian terrorist control of Hamas. And that, to me, is the most tragic. The violence at UCLA is very different than what happened in Columbia, because UCLA is a top state university inside a metropolitan area of extraordinary diversity. Will UCLA or Columbia free Gaza from either Hamas or the terror of, quote, Israel's war?
So return to my initial question, and imagine a student with good intentions. Maybe, all right, so imagine a Christian student on campus who is motivated to protest out of a commitment to Christian nonviolence. How does he or she determine that that which he or she has been a part of has slipped into anti-Semitism?
My first question to them is, explain to me, in order for you to hear it yourself, what are the social justice values within your Christian identity that motivate your participation? Are you opposed to all violence? Are you opposed to war? Do you know how this war started? Are you opposed to war in defense of terrorist attacks? Is it the way this war is being fought that motivates your participation? The nature of the war in Gaza today, now almost 7 months later, continues to be motivated by over 130 kidnapped civilians, hostages, most of whom may now be dead. Are you motivated to understand that your protest on behalf of the Palestinians, this war would end when the hostages are returned? So I want to make sure I understand what values bring you to this moment. Because if you don't understand how the war started and you don't understand the hostages, then I ask, what Christian values bring you to this moment? Many people, quote, cross the line to anti-Semitism when they deny the right of a Jewish destiny in its own land. The fact that Jews have only one place on earth where they can determine their own destiny, and that is Israel. If, when you scream from the river to the sea, we want it all, intifada forever, do you mean there should be no Jewish state? You have already decided a two-state solution is not part of your value system. Then you've crossed the line. When you use words like genocide, you are, according to the definitions of anti-Semitism, comparing Israel and Jews to the Nazis. Do you understand where the word genocide comes from? Maybe you're unaware that it is the product of a post-Holocaust legal human rights system created by a Polish Jew who survived. So I would ask anybody, but especially a Christian, what motivates you within the identity with which your church has raised you to support the Palestinian people? I don't inherently think supporting the Palestinian people is anti Semitic. I don't think that criticizing the state and a government of the state of Israel is anti Semitic. I don't think being opposed to Israeli policy is anti Semitic. But denying the Jewish people a right to survive uniquely as a Jewish people, that meets the standard of anti Semitism. Misusing words that compare the Jewish people, Israelis, to Nazis meets the standard of anti Semitism. So, being a Christian opposed to violence, opposed to war, I might ask, excuse me, when you're done with the protest, will you be playing Halo?
In that vein, as a Jew, how do you feel about Christian nonviolence as a position?
I've learned a great deal from it. I think what Dr. King did in translating the Gandhi notion of pacifism as a weapon of protest, I have no problem with at all. The fact that Christian values teach we can change society without the use of violence. I find what Abraham Joshua Heschel did in interpreting the biblical prophets and translating that interpretation into his work with Dr. King in civil rights and his anti-war, anti-Vietnam position. No problem at all. I want all religious people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Shinto, anybody who lays claim to a religious identity, I invite them to live out that identity in a value system that makes the world a better place. I'm not opposed to it at all. But can we take the time to share a discourse in which we understand each other and why we're doing this? I am not looking for unanimity and agreement. There were and are Jews inside these encampments. And then I was sent a picture by a student at IU showing Chabad, the ultra Orthodox student group, waving a Trump flag and an American flag, screaming, USA, USA. Okay. Those are both Jews. And I have to find a place to make sure the community can still support them. The diversity of our times requires critical perspective. The evangelicals who support Israel for the purpose of rapture, where are they in relationship to these protests?
Yeah.
I'm told that U.S. House Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is opposed to the new House bill defining anti-Semitism because she does not want to rule out the gospel's description of Jews turning on Jesus in his trial.
Because I'm sure she's in church every Sunday.
With Boebert. I'm sure they're there together.
No, I mean, so in this article, Ross Douthat so he's talking about the very specific preoccupations of current intellectual history and how it's taught. And then he writes, but if you're willing to simplify and flatten history, 20th century history especially, it is easier to make these preoccupations fit Israel-Palestine. With its unusual position in the Middle East, its relatively recent founding, its close relationship to the United States, its settlements and occupation, Israel gets to be the singular scapegoat for the sins of defunct European empires and white supremacist regimes. Sometimes this scapegoating seems unconscious, but quite often it's entirely literal, as in the video circulating this week in which one of the organizers of the Columbia protests explicitly analyzes between contemporary Zionists to the slaveholders of pre-revolutionary Haiti, whom he says were justly murdered by their slaves.
Jewish students attempting to walk across the encampment were prevented from their student cohorts when they screamed, "Zionists approaching, Zionists approaching. Don't let the Zionists in." I want to know the difference between that and in 1936-37, Jewish students at school being harangued, harassed, ultimately forced to wear a Star of David by the government. Do I think these people are Jew haters? I'm not sure. I think truly they don't understand what they're saying and are motivated by a crowd contagion for what they hope will be the right cause.
So, and that gets at the question. So, the Bulwark, Jonathan Lass at the Bulwark shared an article last week, I believe, written by the Catholic chaplain at Columbia, who was a friend of his. And the chaplain wanted to make careful distinctions between the students who were protesting, the outsiders who were protesting against Israel, and then the outsiders like Speaker Johnson, who were also there. And thinking about these different groups, have you seen any attention in the press given to outside groups that are funding and spreading this pro-Hamas narrative?
Look, there are all kinds of interesting conspiratorial implications.
Because it's not just a spontaneous contagion, to get back to your original analogy.
No, there are lots of articles that are going back and attempting to link a great deal of Arab oil money and their investment throughout U.S. universities. Do you want to share in fossil fuel wealth? So Yale has built an entire campus. Do you want a new museum? You don't want it from the Sacklers. Do you want it from any of the oil parts of the Arab world? Would you permit someone from Saudi Arabia to fund your Middle East studies program? It's a reasonable question that funders want more than giving the gift. They want a investment in their name and in their influence. Do I think that there is outside, and now there's a big question. Did someone call REI and say, make sure there are enough tents for 50 encampments across the country? Okay, that feeds a lot of late night jokes. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the positive thing about REI is because of their return policy, after the protests are done, you can return them for a refund. Correct. No questions asked.
Look, is it easier for me to conceive of a oil Arab conspiracy rather than a far left empty vacuum conspiracy. I don't know. How did this happen so quickly? In the span of 2 weeks, the university systems of the United States, elite, state, and smaller state schools, Portland State, Humboldt State. Look, this is an ugly, divided country. Last week, you could listen to the Supreme Court argumentation about presidential immunity, and in the upper left-hand column, watch the streaming from a Manhattan courtroom. This is another moment of the dark division in our country. The President of the United States will talk about anti-Semitism from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial, coming up this week. Everything is a campaign element now.
Mm-hmm.
How do you translate what this means? It is the university system in America chaos and hatred, or is it part of a domain of divisive political discourse? I wish I could answer. I don't want to believe that the university system, where we believed liberal values of democracy could be sustained and engendered, has now been lost to the extremes. I don't believe that. I don't want to believe that we've lost that institution. So your question is an essential question. Your church, just as a movement, decided we were wrong about the past and we're going to re-vote about the nature of our relationship institutionally, well, with the LGBTQ. Is that a great moment? Because they looked at the past and they see where they are today. Yes, we need to study that. How did that happen? While at the same time, you sent me that there are now parts of the United Methodist Church participating in the pro-Palestinian movement.
Mm-hmm.
So they're reading history correctly as they go from the past and make a change about sexual orientation, but they seem not to be reading history with regard to, we're going to participate only in the pro-Palestinian. We're not going to make a statement about free all the hostages.
I mean, I think that is a charitable way of interpreting. Another interpretation might be that these are just two issues that fall into the same ideological box, and so you're carrying both of them.
Can't we be a little nuanced? Can't we, instead of meeting the DEI check off, make sure you're today safe, can't we say, okay, we need to help the Palestinians? How about the hundreds of thousands of Jews who have been displaced from the north?
Yeah.
Look, the state of Israel, you do not want to imagine what Israelis are going through as they now better understand they're going to get body bags back. In the latest negotiations, 22 to 30. Is that the number now we must acknowledge? The only living hostages? So I wish the protests could begin every day globally with a single 15-minute screaming, "We want the hostages freed." Kidnapping bodies is a new level of intolerable cruelty. We are in favor of a people's dignity, but that dignity must be anchored in the common decency. I worry that these students who are now expelled, as well they should be. By the way, protests are inherent in I'm doing this in order to get arrested. You don't protest to have people go, "Hi, how are you? All things good?" You protest in order to be disruptive, and that's right, and they've been expelled. They've lost a whole year. I hope that this does not completely throw their lives off track. Sincerely, some of them, though thoughtless, mean well.
Well, and it's hard not to come to the conclusion that um, university administrators are sympathetic. Um, you know, I was just thinking that a university like Columbia costs like $80,000 a year, um, and is prestigious, right? So it's the university holds all the cards when it comes to leverage. Um, but by and large, the schools have not conducted themselves as though they are entirely in control of the situation, um, and so it just invites questions about motivation.
I don't know what it is that we expect from a university president. I don't know. Are they supposed to be the image of great scholars, providing how that vision can grow and morph given the realities of the time? Do we want them to be fundraisers? Do we want them to be the beacon that draws a new generation of scholars? I don't know. The idiocy of the first three university presidents being unable to answer a question, albeit Elise Stefanik doing her imitation of Joe McCarthy. You should be able to answer the question: screaming genocide, 2 Jews on campus. That should not require context. Did the Columbia president do much better when pinned against the wall about firing tenured professors? No, this is a politicized and nearly weaponized use of Congress, government, and the university system. Why aren't they prepared? That's an excellent question. There is nothing new that has happened here.
Yeah.
And when you say they, on whose side do you think most administrators find themselves? I don't know. I honestly, they can't honestly believe that the funders who give them big money are going to want disruption and chaos. Political positioning notwithstanding. Look, we've both led congregations. Congregations are voluntary communities that seek a home for religious affiliation. We know that we have to be careful that we don't make public statements that misstate the diversity in our communities. Okay, sometimes we have to be prophetic and warn the congregation of our prophetic impulse. I would have thought that university presidents could have figured out how to handle this kind of political diversity at a moment in US history with there are so many signals.
Yeah.
That the extremes are the people creating the discourse. Not a single university president has been able to establish. Can we find a center, please? That, to me, is the saddest part of what universities today represent. Not a place to gather and think, learn, engage in the difficult act of reflection, thinking about what we are thinking about. No university is going to change the complex historical reality of Israel and the Palestinians. Even if 10 universities divest, it won't change the complex historical reality of Israel and the Palestinians. They've done studies that divestment did not influence the fall of apartheid in South Africa. So you can think that at 19 or 20, you understand how to move foundation money around. You want to do something serious for the Palestinians. Stop, study, and learn who they are. I would like Christians to make a distinction for themselves between Christian Palestinians and Muslim Palestinians. Are they helping both communities?
It's I thought this earlier, but it's become more present of mind the last week or so that moving forward, this will be an issue that disrupts and ends friendships.
It has already.
Yeah.
And the divisions within the Jewish community have surfaced and are becoming sharper and much more painfully political. And as the circumstances play out in Israel, it will become even worse. Not maybe for us, but for new generations of rabbis and ministers, priests. How do you start an interfaith relationship now?
Yeah.
I go back to what I said at the beginning. We must, each of us, begin a campaign of what do you mean? We must ask each other, I don't understand. What do you mean? That is the only way we will collectively reconstitute a shared discourse. And as we move further and further into the political realm, there will be less and less we share. That is ultimately what campaigns do, what the media does. The university protests will become part of that campaign. It's not good for the Jews that commencement will be canceled.
Yeah.
So we will be evaluating this for a long time. Long time. Robert Kraft saying to Columbia, I'm going to stop giving you my money, is an honest way of understanding the value of funding. But it also sets an affirmation to the meme of Jews and their wealth.
Yeah. It was just...
No good way to get out of that.
And that's relevant. So Ross Douthat, the conclusion to this article that you sent, he writes, the truth is that these aspects of contemporary protest politics are not just a recrudescence of past bigotries. They are partially that, but they are also something stranger, a reflection of a worldview that has come to its anti-Semitic temptations through a circuitous route. This worldview is broad enough to set curricula, but too narrow to find full purchase in the world as it exists, intent on finding enemies, but discovering more of them in the past than in the present, and fastening on Israel with a sense of excited vindication, a spirit that yields easily, as righteous vindication often does, to hate.
I
think
I don't simply agree. I think the value of his op-ed is a way for all of us to understand that what has happened over the last many weeks is a statement that we have not been watching. There is a value and necessity for America to be accountable for the racism that has marginalized a community historically and today. No question. But we have not been watching as that concern has now incorporated itself into the way universities think.
Yeah, I think to put what he was saying in a more specifically Christian theological register, I would say that one of the things we're seeing is the danger when people try to seek and acquire and establish their righteousness in a way other than through the faith.
Leviticus 16:17 would be interesting to study how the ancient temple rites of Yom Kippur, redemption, repentance, one goat is slaughtered by the priests according to the ancient rites.
Just like Christy Nome.
Yes. A second goat, the Azazel, the scapegoat, is chased out into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the people. And that is who Israel, Zionists, Jews have become in the last month. Excuse me, 1 minute. I'm going to call you back in 2 minutes. And here's the fear. The fear is going to be that few people will listen to this conversation, read that op-ed, and it's quicker, simply quicker, to look at headlines and the slogans and not understand the cost.
I think I told you it's hard for me now to distinguish between the actual conversation I had with Rabbi Joseph and then the conversation I had with Rabbi Joseph in my head. So if I said this to the real Rabbi Joseph, so our podcast did a live event last Monday in partnership with another podcast, and we were the second segment on the agenda, and the first segment had two interlocutors that were just using the language of genocide unquestionably, and it made me uncomfortable, and then it made me realize, like this is the consensus on the center left in the theological world now, and how quickly that happened.
Yeah, and I think that's the punchline of today. How quickly that happened. That is exactly the punchline. In a month, the university systems of America have succumbed to binary slogans.
And we've talked about this before, but you know, this rhetoric started before the invasion of Gaza, before the bombing of Gaza, and so
this is not new. I saw it all before I retired St. Cloud State. Which simply means our podcast, our conversation, has to be part of what we're all attempting to do. Dialogue.
It's just really uncomfortable. So it's the article I sent you about the United Methodist Church. It's not the case that every delegate there, right, was participating in a pro-Palestinian protest. However, I think any Methodist pastors who would hear you, they're the ones who left the United Methodist Church for the more conservative denomination. So this makes for strange bedfellows.
We're not going to make it. And the Holy One, blessed be she, keeps reminding us, I've given you all the tools you need. Figure it out.
Well, I promise that we will have it figured out by next week when we talk. And
no, I don't want to have it figured out. I want to keep going, thank you. And you'll have more beard grown back.
Hopefully. Good Lord. So, yeah, I will leave you to call your friend back. But
have a great day.